A lot of people think economic success is similar to a game of Monopoly. You acquire things, you charge other people a lot of rent, and you get rich. Our next guest argues that the way societies actually thrive is more like playing Settlers of Catan. All this week on Quicktake The Lead, we are featuring must-read books, and today's pick is the author of Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, Lessons from 100,000 Years of Human History. Johan Fourie is a professor of economics and history at South Africa's Stellenbosch University. And Johan joins us now. Welcome to Quicktake. Johan, I'm really enjoying your book. It's very accessible in its exploration of the roots and reasons for prosperity. So to go back to that analogy, if the modern world is like Settlers of Catan, why is the outcome we have right now like a game of Monopoly, where you have a few big winners and everyone else is kind of struggling to pay rent?
Yeah, good evening, Scarlet. It's great to be here. I think it's fair that we all feel that the world is like a game of Monopoly. We see that they are the rich that get richer, and the rest of us seem to struggle. But that is really, I want to emphasize, that's a feeling, and it's also a feeling that's obviously exacerbated by COVID. But if one takes a bit of a bigger picture and perhaps a longer run view, the world is a much better place than it was a generation ago. And it's not only in terms of income. Certainly, economic growth is skyrocketed in many parts of the developing world. So certainly incomes have increased, but it's also in terms of living standards more generally, like health. We live much better and longer lives, and also perhaps also happier and more meaningful lives. So the longer run view, I think, is important, and that's partly what the book wants to point out, but it's also, I guess, answering why that is. What is the reason for why we are so much better off than a generation or two ago?
Right. And of course, you do this from an Africa-centric perspective. What I thought was really interesting is you talk about Wakanda and how people wonder why there aren't more Wakandas, real Wakandas in the world. I was a history major in college. I avoided taking any economics classes because of those complicated demand curves, but I would have taken it if they taught it like your book does. What did I miss from not examining history from an economics, history, and Africa-centric perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question, and it's a question that many of my students also ask. And so partly the reason for writing this book was exactly that I wanted to show that there's a different side of economics. But of course, not to be too hard on economists and my economics colleagues, is that economics, the models that we use provide some structure, some clarity of thought. And so that's really important. But of course, the world is a messy place, and often these structures don't really kind of transplant very well to the templates of providing real world advice. And so I think that's really where history is incredibly important, because it shows actually the kind of complexity and the messiness of the real world. And we can learn from that. And I guess the good news is that more of the world's top economics departments are realizing that, and they're reintroducing economic history courses back into the curriculum. So I think there is somewhat of a change, and hopefully the book can help to do that.
Right. Well, one thing that your book did do for me is open up the idea of slavery and explain some of the historical roots of it as well. What surprised me was that there was slavery on the African continent long before the Europeans showed up. And geography is one of the big reasons why. Can you explain that briefly?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short, but it is, geography plays an important role. Of course, perhaps just a footnote is that, slavery is not unique to Africa. Of course, it's been across, all the part of the world. And in fact, the word comes from Slavic, and that's obviously Eastern Europe. But I think it's useful to think of it in terms of pre-colonial systems in Africa, and the factory endowments that Africa had and still have to some extent, is the fact that Africa is a huge continent, a large landmass, and relatively few people. And so if there was conflict in Africa, what Africans wanted was not really so much the land, because land was abundant. It was people, because people were scarce. And so you see this development of indigenous slavery. And again, I must stress that that's a very different system, of course, from the Atlantic slave trade, which came much later. But it also partly explains other cultural institutions like bride price and polygamy.
Got it. So it was labor that was scarce, not land in Africa. Indigenous African slavery was pretty small in scale, nothing like what we saw in the New World. And we know the impact of slavery in the Americas, exclusion, inequality of Black people for generations to come. What kind of impact did the Atlantic slave trade have on the economic development of Africa, the continent?
Yeah, I think you're right to stress that a lot of work has been done on the US, and of course for valid reasons, and we see current discussions about it still. But to a large extent, the kind of the effects of slavery in Africa has been neglected, or at least the long run effects, until say about a decade ago, when Harvard professor Nathan Nunn, is now at Harvard, produced a paper that showed that there's a subsistent effect of slavery on economic development today. So basically, from those regions where a lot of slaves were captured, those regions are still relatively poorer today compared to other regions in Africa. And so the novel thing about his research was not only to show that there's this correlation, but also that it's a causal link. And since then, there's been a lot more work about why that there's this relationship from the past to the present. And it's kind of linked to two kind of interesting papers, partly which he also collaborated on, but also with other scholars, showing that it's through ruggedness and through trust.
And that's only just scratching the surface of what your book explores. Johan, really appreciate your taking the time and giving us a taste of what's in your book. Johan Forey is professor of economics and history.